All right, Chargers fans, welcome back to the Guilty as Charged podcast. I'm so happy to be joined by Brendan Sonnone, who covers the Florida State Seminoles, who obviously the Chargers have a budding connection with the Seminoles with all the players recently coming in. So Brendan, pardon me, I should say, covers the Florida State Seminoles for 247 Sports, does a wonderful job there. Brendan, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing well, Stephen. Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's an honor to be here and be talking about, I guess, FSU West, which is the Chargers these days.
Yeah, it's been obviously a lot of great fun having Derwin James on the roster, and then they got Gabe Neighbors as an undrafted free agent, and then this year they really drafted two really great players that I'm really excited about in Asante Samuel Jr. and Tre McKitty. Tre McKitty obviously finished his career at Georgia, but I wanted to get Brendan's thoughts on his career, starting his career at Florida State. So, just in general, before we dive into both of these players, what was your reaction when the Chargers drafted Asante Samuel Jr. with the 47th overall pick this year?
So my initial thought was one that's really great value, because I'm a big draft nerd and I have my own like big board and I scout like hundreds of guys like just for fun is what I do in the off season. So
Yeah.
I had Asante as like a top 30 prospect or so. And I wasn't sure if he was going to go in the first round because, and I'm sure we'll talk about it, but his size limitations and being 5'10", about like a buck 85, he doesn't fit the prototype in that regard. So I thought maybe, with all these mock drafts having to go in the first round, that was a little generous, but in terms of, the caliber of player he is, I thought, okay, like, once he got past like the 40 range, I'm like, okay, this will be the time where we should see him. Then we start getting to the late 40s, and I start getting a little nervous for Asante, to be honest. I wasn't really sure, like, okay, is there a big drop coming? But then obviously the Chargers come in at 47 overall. And yes, even my thought was like, that's legitimately really good value for him, for a player
100%.
of his caliber at that spot. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm so excited for them. We were talking before this. The Chargers getting Rashawn Slater in the first round, and Asante Samuel in the second round. It could not have gone better for them. I think the Chargers surprised a lot of people when they took Tre McKitty with their third round pick at 97. What was your reaction there when they did make that selection?
Yeah, I thought that was a little early, just based on, again, what all the pundits are saying. And Tre McKitty had a nice career at Florida State, and some of the metrics at Georgia. And I obviously lost some track of him when he transferred from FSU to Georgia, but he was dinged up early on at Georgia and didn't play the full season. The metrics were pretty good for him. He was efficient, but didn't have huge numbers. So I thought that would like maybe suppress his draft stock, but obviously the Chargers feel like they saw something different in him and saw a complete tight end. So I thought it was like maybe a round or two earlier than I was expecting, but Tre, we'll talk about it. Tre has some tools to work with as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm excited about him as well. So let's dive into the, who these players are, because I think, we see them, most recently, and that's kind of, what NFL fans are looking at it is who they were in 2020. What do you remember about Asante Samuel Jr.'s recruiting process? Obviously brought, the name recognition, the pedigree to, the recruiting process. So why did he choose Florida State, and what was kind of the reaction to him signing with the Seminoles?
Yeah, he was a big time commitment. He was a big time recruit. He was a top 100 guy or so, wire to wire. I think he finished like 60th nationally in the 2018 recruiting class in the 24/7 Sports composite rankings. And I remember at the time, myself and my colleague Chris Nee we did a podcast at the time when he had, I think he had committed, or when the final rankings come out. But we were trying to talk about, like, didn't think there was like 60 players better than him in the country. We honestly thought that was a little low. We thought he was more of like a top 40 type of player and a borderline 5-star. The big hindrance on him then as a recruit, it's the same thing now in the NFL. It's the size. That's really the only consistent knock you'll get on him before he started getting nitpicky. Is that he was shorter. I think in high school he was about 165 pounds. So
yeah.
So he said, we're talking about thin, but he was, obviously he had the name with his dad being Asante Samuel. And the one thing that was consistent, he played in South Florida. He played at St. Thomas Aquinas, which is a powerhouse in Fort Lauderdale. You go ahead and pull up NFL rosters, you will find, without looking too far, someone from St. Thomas Aquinas, especially at that point. They were just rolling them out. So he was a really good player. Had a really good program, was also really good in like the 7-on-7 scenes and off-season stuff too, because he was a competitor. People call him a dog, and he called himself like an alpha dog. Like, that's something that he took pride in. I remember when he committed to Florida State, or not after. So he committed under Jimbo Fisher's regime. Jimbo Fisher ends up leaving for Texas A&M. Willie Taggart comes in. They have to re-recruit him basically because I think it was Miami and some other schools were going in on Asante Samuel Jr. because he's a good player and you're trying to get that vulnerability, right? That FSU leaves the door open there. But FSU holds on to him. Willie Taggart did a really good job kind of re-recruiting him. But Harlan Barnett, the defensive coordinator at the time, told when he got Asante there for an official visit, the first thing he told Asante Samuel Jr., he's like, I like the look in your eyes. Like, you look mad. And Asante, to Harlan's credit, Asante always played that way. Like, Asante plays with a chip on his shoulder. He plays pissed off. I don't know entirely why, if it's just the size thing, if it's like, hey, I play the same position as my dad and have the same name and has that going for him. I've always felt like that's been kind of it. But yeah, he was a big deal at the time when he committed to Florida State, and they were lucky to hold on to him.
Was there ever any doubt that he was going to end up at Florida State? Like, what was that crystal ball process like for him?
I'm trying to recall. I think it wasn't a super dramatic recruitment until Jimbo Fisher left, and then that opened the door.
Okay.
But Florida State did well to kind of close it in quickly, and I think they got him in on the early signing period, so it wasn't this long drawn out one. For whatever reason, I don't know if he grew up a Florida State fan, but despite getting some push from Miami and some other schools, like it wasn't this really like Trey. We'll get into Tre McKitty's, I'm sure, but like his process was a little bit more dramatic than Asante's. Asante's was pretty straightforward as a recruiting process.
Okay, so what was more dramatic about Tre McKitty? Because as far as I know, I didn't know who Tre McKitty was until he was at Georgia. So what was that process like for him?
So he was a high-end 3-star recruit. Try to think. So he was coveted by a handful of schools. Miami was always in the mix for him. Florida State was always in the mix for him. He went to Bradenton. He's from Tampa area, but went to Bradenton IMG Academy, which IMG Academy is another powerhouse. That's like it's not a private school. I'm trying to think of how to describe it, but it's basically just a pipeline for
it's a football school.
yeah, that's exactly what it is. They play sports there at IMG Academy. It's what they do. It's like where it's just where all the great athletes go and for all different sports. It's immaculate facilities. So Tre McKitty went there, and he commits to Oregon in the summer ahead of his senior year. And I think he did it while he was like at one of the opening events or whatnot. And I remember there being some controversy at the time that his parents weren't super thrilled with it. They wanted to get out there. They didn't want him to be all the way across the country. He's a Florida kid. They didn't want him to go literally across the country.
Yeah.
Ironic now that he's playing for the Chargers. But
he could have been catching passes from Justin Herbert in college, and now he's going to do it from the NFL.
I didn't even think of that. I didn't even think of
hilarious.
that. Yeah, it's funny how life works out. But so he's committed to Oregon for several months, and Florida State never really stops recruiting him. That was the guy they wanted, they targeted. They liked his potential as a pro style tight end because he was more regarded as an athlete in high school, as a more athletic tight end, but they saw some potential as someone who could be a good inline blocker as well. He's serviceable for what Jimbo Fisher liked to do. So they kept recruiting him. Now, interesting that Willie Taggart ends up taking over at Oregon at the end of the season, like in December.
Oh my gosh.
So he gets hired. Willie Taggart had a connection to Tre McKitty because Willie Taggart was at USF Tampa, and I think Willie Taggart was his first offer at USF. And really, I mean, McKitty liked the idea of okay, it's going to be a spread offense, and I could be used as an H-back, as a slot wide receiver, still do some inline blocking and stuff like that, but ultimately, the distance was the factor for Tre McKitty. The parents were just not comfortable with it. And at the end of the day, they get him back. Florida State gets him. And it was kind of like a long rumor, hey, it's probably going to happen. It does happen during the early signing period. FSU gets him. And then, again, talking about ironic, then end up Willie Taggart a year later ends up coming to Florida State. Remember Willie making a joke being good thing you didn't burn any bridges, the way you left. And so, it was interesting recruitment for Tre McKitty, but FSU was really happy they got him at the time. That was one they put a lot of time into.
Man, life really went full circle on various fronts for Tre McKitty there.
Tre McKitty. and one little tidbit on Tre McKitty, too, because he's going, I'll tie this one, so he's going to have to fly cross country a lot. He's either getting his pilot's license or has gotten it. He's a different, more cerebral type of guy, very thoughtful. So not your typical, just head in the dirt football player. He's very balanced. So he's working on getting his pilot's license as well. He may have already gotten it at this point.
Wow, there we go. Some great info from Brendan here. You mentioned the I don't want to say dramatic process of the Florida State coaching staff. I don't know if that's an
Oh,
accurate way to say that.
it's been a dramatic few years, man. It's fine. It's been a bit of a cluster in Tallahassee. I think that's fair.
So you mentioned how that kind of impacted Asante Samuel Jr. How did you see him handling that process? How did you see him grow as a person, as a human being, as a young kid throughout his 3 years at Florida State?
So Asante to me was so in 3 years. So he gets to Florida State in 2018. That's the first year of the Willie Taggart era. Again, it wasn't the coach he initially committed to, but he stays committed to Florida State. Harlan Barnett comes from Michigan State and runs this cover 4 press scheme that Asante, even though doesn't have the optimal size for, like the way he plays, the physicality, the footwork that he brings, like that's fine. They can work with all of those things. Things like Darquez Denard was maybe like 5'11" or so, if I'm not mistaken, and did really well at Michigan State. So they like, we could work with this. So he steps in pretty early on, doesn't start, but gets thrown to the fire and has some really like big rookie moments, like learning curve stuff where in a closely contested game against Miami that was pivotal for FSU that season, and they end up squandering like a 20-point lead. He gets picked on a couple times against Lawrence Cager, who's like 6'6" and kind of a jump ball specialist. Why Asante Samuel's isolated 2 plays in a row in the red zone against Lawrence Cager, I don't know. But he defends the first one well. The second one, again, just like physics, like you're not going to be able to defend that no matter how good your technique is all the time. They give a touchdown there. And then Asante also had a costly penalty on a blocked field goal. And I can't remember the game, but it was, again, he was trying to be aggressive. He's over aggressive, gets a block, gets a run into the kicker call, if I recall correctly. And that ended up being a big swing moment in that game. So Asante kind of takes his lumps as a true freshman. Gives up, I think, 6 touchdowns. So, but he wasn't bad by any means. You could see the potential was there. I think people were really high on him. It just, there was a true freshman that was thrown into the fire. Year 2 comes around. He establishes a starting spot for himself. But it's a different scheme, kind of. They bring in Harlan Barnett's the defensive coordinator, but then they bring in Jim Leavitt like 2 or 3 weeks into the season. It's like a shadow defensive coordinator. It's a really weird deal. It's a different scheme. FSU's trying to do all this weird hybrid stuff. That wasn't what Harlan Barnett was brought in to do. So, and then, Asante has a really good season in year 2. Very, I think the touchdowns gets cut down from like 6 to 3, gets a couple interceptions, just more confident, clearly like stable, consistent, and kind of a port in the storm where there wasn't a whole lot of consistency on that defense or in the program. And then year 3, a new coaching staff, a new scheme with Adam Fuller, a lot more man coverage, which Asante really thrived in. And again, the touchdowns go down, I think, from either 3 or 2 to 1. He only allowed 1 this year per PFF. So he got consistently better every year, and he handled his business. I think that's the one thing, Steven, that was really stood out to me, was that they never had to push him particularly like hard because he was always the one kind of setting the tone. Remember Mike Norvell talking about early on in preseason camp, there was one day where he did have to kind of get after Asante a little bit, but it was almost more like just to see what Asante would do and respond to it. And Asante just kind of looked at him and was like, I got you. And Norvell loved it. And I'm sure Norvell talked about Asante really glowingly during the pre-draft process to teams because Asante was just someone in a locker room that was hesitant and skeptical to buy into another coach and Mike Norvell, and all that was pretty well documented that Norvell had some issues in year 1 with guys trusting him and a lot of turnover. Asante wasn't one of those issues. He was someone who bought in right away, just handled his business. I remember after the Georgia Tech game in the opener of 2020 season, FSU loses. It was inexplicably so. It was just like kind of like, oh, here we go again. They start off strong. They march down the field on their opening drive, score a touchdown, offense looks sharp, and then there's like a 40-minute rain delay, and then another one, and all of a sudden like they come back out and they're just flat and they lose that game. Asante Samuel had 2 interceptions that game. I remember walking back to the parking garage afterwards, and Asante Samuel was in his car and just kind of like driving by smiling. You could tell he wasn't like down. He wasn't happy with himself either. He was just really content. And you could just tell that was someone who just went and handled his business that day and knew he left it on the field and did what he could. And that always struck me as like, that just seemed like Asante's demeanor, just really even keeled, kind of content with what he was doing. And just someone who, again, like did what he was supposed to do consistently. That's how I'll remember Asante and his growth and who he was at FSU.
That's fantastic insight. And I've always said this, I think one of the most important aspects of playing the cornerback position in the NFL is being able to stay even keeled and be who you are every single week, every single quarter, regardless of, what's going on around you. So that's great stuff. What was college like for Tre McKitty? Because you mentioned him as a cerebral guy, getting his pilot license. So what kind of growth did you see from Tre over his years at Florida State?
Yeah, so Tre comes in as a true freshman, and it's the 2017 season, and that's Jimbo Fisher's last year. It's a weird year. It starts off with DeAndre Francois tearing his ACL and all sorts of ligaments in his knee in that season opener against Alabama, and it's this build as like the opener of the century or whatever. It's 1 Alabama versus 3 FSU, and FSU has a chance to go ahead early in that game and going into halftime, and there's a penalty that's not called, and lo and behold, Alabama just pulls away and does what Alabama does. DeAndre Francois gets hurt at the end of the game. And after that, man, the season kind of turns into a cluster. There's a hurricane that creates a delay. And all of a sudden, FSU's playing James Blackman, who's a true freshman who was not supposed to play until like his redshirt sophomore year or so. And he's playing 2 or 3 years at it. He's like 165 pounds, 6'5" quarterback. Like it was just a bad situation. So Tre McKitty ends up getting some burn later in this year. I think he ends up, I'm pulling up the numbers now. He gets 91 snaps. So he plays a little bit as a true freshman, shows some good signs actually, like as a receiver and as a blocker, and shows some promise. It's just a weird year to really judge all these young guys who are playing because Jimbo ends up leaving, and it was just this weird environment all around the program. Next year, Tre McKitty jumps into a full-time role under Willie Taggart and his lethal simplicity offense of being a full-time guy. He plays 663 snaps. So he goes from 91 to 600.
It's a big jump.
There for sure. And a new scheme, not the scheme he was necessarily recruited for. And they use him all over the place. So sometimes he's an inline tight end. Sometimes he's more in the backfield as like an H-back. The offensive line, by the way, is awful this year. It's maybe the worst in college football. He's Power 5. They were atrocious in 2018. And he was also in the slot a lot as well. So they use him all over the place. He was productive, but just not super efficient, especially as a blocker. I just never really kind of materialized from. You'd see these little signs where he would make some nice plays, either like after the catch or get in the open field and make some nice moves. You see all the athleticism, just never really puts it all together. And then 2019, he has a new offensive coordinator. It's Kendall Briles. It's a similar system to what Willie Taggart was utilizing before, but not quite the same. So again, this is a guy talk about just weird program here, 3 different offensive schemes in 3 different years for Tre McKitty. He has a good year. He's solid, but they have to leave him back a lot to block because the offensive line is still an issue. They use him and Gabe Neighbors as blockers quite a bit. And really they put Tre McKitty in some bad situations where he's having like an ISO'd on defensive ends a lot. And it's just not optimal for his skill set. So to me, it was someone like he was. Oh, and also in that 2019 season, Chargers fans can Google this. There was this like mini quote unquote controversy where Tre McKitty standing in the wrong direction.
Oh,
have you seen this?
I've seen it. I've seen the picture of it. I didn't know it was him, but I remember seeing the picture going like, what the hell is going on down in Florida State?
It was a huge deal. It was just like another like, oh, this is just not what FSU needs kind of deal. They don't look like they know what they're doing. It was so overblown because basically with Kendall Briles' scheme, it's like with this tempo they're running, this crazy tempo, and you can go ahead and you line up in a spot and you can line up however you want, wherever you want. And then they then they'll get you into the right formation and you move. So it wasn't like it didn't impact the play. It didn't do anything negatively. The play was actually went for like a 9-yard gain too. So like, but the frame of like Tre standing in this direction was like, people say like Tre didn't know what he was doing. The FSU didn't know what he was doing. It was kind of overblown. But so that was to kind of point out just the meat grinder that Tre McKitty was in during his FSU career. I think that symbolizes it well. But Tre never really complained. He was always considered really kind of professional in how he handled himself and thoughtful, like I said, cerebral and just solid, steady guy who I think didn't quite live up to what they wanted him to be. But like, I wouldn't say it was a disappointment either. I'll say this, that when he left, the fan base was like, good riddance. But they also said the same thing about Landon Dickerson. And that,
oh geez.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
I died on that hill where I was like, yeah, you guys want Landon Dickerson. Like, no, if he doesn't want to be here, we don't want him. And I was like, all right. Like, I know he's injured a lot, but yeah.
Oh no.
There were some cultural issues at FSU where they weren't maximizing some of their assets. But I will say this, when Tre McKitty left for Georgia and he transferred, the new coaching staff, Mike Norvell's, they love utilizing tight ends. They get very creative with it and they mix between pro style concepts and a lot of RPO things and things that are going on in the NFL now. Norvell's been very cutting edge with, and he loves utilizing a couple tight ends at once still.
Mhm.
They were upset when Tre McKitty left. They really wanted to keep him. That would have been a big feather in their cap. And I think to utilize him in their offense with Cam McDonald, who's very athletic, Tre would have been in line. He would have been able to move out some too, though. And a staff that I value Mike Norvell's ability to evaluate talent. I value that. And I think them seeing Tre McKitty as a loss at the time was something that stuck with me.
Well, I would be interested in hearing then if, I mean, obviously it seems like it has worked out for Tre, but I kind of wonder if he maybe regrets that decision because, I mean, he only had, I think, 6 catches this year at Georgia. So I kind of wonder what that process was like for him going from potentially an offense where he would have been featured to, getting 2 or 3 targets a game if he was lucky.
Like you said, it worked out, and that's again kind of why I was just surprised by the draft status of him, of where he went, because he was used so much as a blocker at Georgia. Now apparently, I got the metrics in front of me, like his run block PFF grade is really good. It's 75.8 this past year at Georgia. I didn't watch a whole lot of Georgia football. Comparatively, he was between 45 and 58 in his 3 years at FSU previously. So I think having a better supporting cast, having better offensive line around to help out with blocking and more competency, where you're not not playing in space and blocking in space to where you're being left to guard a tight end or a defensive end one-on-one. I think all that helped Tre because he can catch the ball. He can adjust to the ball very well. He's not super flexible. He's not this kind of poetic in the air, adjust to the ball like Antonio Gates type, but he is solid, good hands, uses his body well, and good straight line speed too, just not super wiggle, I guess. But the blocking was the big question on him. And I think the fact that he was able to do that at Georgia at a high level probably helps his draft stock at the end of the day. It certainly seems like it did.
Man, the whole experience for Tre McKitty, just all the full circles, going to Georgia, but getting fewer targets, but improving as a blocker. Just a fun journey to listen to about Tre McKitty. So we'll kind of wrap it up here. I think Chargers fans in general are very, very excited about Asante Samuel Jr. What do you think? I mean, we've kind of talked about his mentality on the field. What do you think the Chargers are getting in Asante Samuel Jr.?
So I think the first thing is you're gonna get someone who, one, super competitive, that is not going to back down. There's a clip that I put out in 2018, his freshman year, against AJ Dillon. AJ Dillon either gets a toss or gets a stretch concept. He gets outside the tackle box and he's in the open, starting to get in the open field. And Asante Samuel Jr. just closes in on AJ Dillon. And there's about 40 to 50 to maybe even 60-pound discrepancy between the two of them.
I was going to say, yeah, it might be lowballing
it. He missile, yeah, because this is true freshman Asante Samuel Jr., excuse me. So yes, this is him probably like a $175 at the time. He just missiles into AJ Dillon's legs, undercuts him. I mean, you take out anyone by the legs, that's going to work. But the fact he went in so fearlessly, didn't hesitate, got the tackle, that's a lasting memory of an Asante Samuel play that I think is quintessential Asante Samuel. That's what you get with him, is someone who's not going to back down. That doesn't mean he's always going to get the job done as a tackler. He does have the size restriction, but effort isn't going to be an issue for him. As far as coverage skills, he's really solid. Very quick feet, very technically sound there. I think he can be a little over aggressive, a little handsy at times, but that's stuff you can kind of coach out a little bit. He also has the ability to play inside and play nickel, which I think is something that the Chargers GM had talked about too. They look him as an outside-inside guy, but he can, make no mistake, he can play outside. That's what he did primarily at Florida State. They weren't always moving him into nickel. They wanted him on the opponent's best wide receiver quite often. So he's just really consistent, very steady. I don't know if Asante Samuel Jr. ends up being a Pro Bowler or not. I would be shocked if he didn't have a 10-year career in the NFL, though. I think that he's a very safe prospect in that regard.
Yeah, I love that. And honestly, the Chargers need that. It's funny because I feel like the same way about Rashawn Slater, and that the two of them are very similar in what they'll bring to the Chargers, I think, in terms of consistency, flexibility, and versatility. So last one here. The Tre McKitty experience, I've learned, has been a wild ride in college. What do you think Chargers fans can look forward to getting out of Tre McKitty as a professional player?
Again, I think there's going to be a level of professionalism that he's going to bring to the organization. There's going to be some stability and some dependability there. So I do think there's a baseline of if that's your tight end too consistently, I think you're going to be fine with that. Now, I'm not sure I'm sold on him becoming like your tight end one and eventually becoming a go-to guy there, like for as a primary target, like how they use their tight end now. Uh, but I do think he's going to have a nice long NFL career as well. And I think the value of like if you think you can see growth of him as an inline blocker, which is how they're viewing him right now, and say, okay, he's
Yeah.
going to do the dirty work for us. I think there's value there because there's still room to grow, but he has the frame, he has the willingness to do it, and he showed at Georgia, like in that type of system and in a pro style scheme, he can make that growth. Um, but there's also passing production to be had with him as well. He's very quick to get downfield. Again, not super like yard after the catch, wiggly type of guy, a little tight hipped, but good hands, good arm length, like good catch radius there. So I think there's a potential for him to just be a really nice, consistent high end tight end two, if not like a low end tight end one. If you have another good tight end to complement with, but obviously the Chargers currently okay at tight end, but he'll be a really nice complementary piece, I think, for a long time.
Yeah, he landed in a great spot. Obviously, the Chargers have a great track record with tight ends. They've got Jared Cook to take some pressure off of him, initially. So I'm really excited to see how that pans out. Brendan, this has been awesome, man. I think Chargers fans and our listeners are going to be very happy with the kind of background information that they've been getting today from Brendan on behalf of Asante Samuel Jr. and Tre McKitty. So thank you so much for joining us, man. And if you are a Florida State Seminole fan, or interested in learning more about this budding pipeline the Chargers have, make sure and give a follow to Brendan on Twitter at @bsonnone on Twitter, and check him out on Knowles 247. Thanks again, Brendan.
Oh, for sure. Thanks for having me.